And now, some news from the world over. The Eastern Orthodox Church is facing a new great schism. Maybe. As the Russian Orthodox Church has cut ties with the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople. In effect, the move splits the Russian Church and its 150 million members from the rest of the Eastern Orthodox communion. The Russian Church is objecting to Bartholomew I's official recognition of two Ukrainian churches as independent of the Patriarchate of Moscow. A spokesman for the Russian Orthodox Church called Bartholomew's actions lawless and canonically void. To be sure, the churches in Russia and the Ukraine have become intertwined with secular conflicts of the region, continuing the ecclesial discord. Both churches have close relations with their national political leaders. Church watchers predict that the new Russian Orthodox schism could last weeks or even decades. And in an unprecedented move, Pope Francis this week removed from the priesthood two Chilean bishops for their abuse of minors. Francisco José Cox, the former Archbishop of La Serena and a high-ranking Vatican official, as well as 53-year-old Marco Antonio Ordenes, were dismissed from the clerical state by the Pope this past week. No appeal is possible. Both had previously resigned as bishops in light of these abuse allegations. Vatican spokesman Greg Burke suggested their laicizations and the Vatican's detailed announcement are ways the Church plans to handle their past missteps with bishops. Watch.
We have to remember the victims of abuse here. It's important for them to know that someone is no longer a priest, and it's important for them to know why he's no longer a priest, why he's been defrocked. This is even more essential in the case of a bishop.
The U.S. Justice Department has opened an investigation of child sexual abuse inside the Catholic Church in Pennsylvania. The federal investigation is the first of its kind in that it focuses on the sex abuse scandal and comes following the recent Pennsylvania grand jury report. That report found that 301 predator priests had sexually abused more than 1,000 individuals over 7 decades. It further claimed that church leaders had covered up for the offenders. Sources tell the Associated Press subpoenas have been issued for confidential files and testimony from church leaders. The U.S. Attorney in Philadelphia is demanding that the bishops turn over any evidence that anyone in their ranks took children across state lines for illicit purposes, sent sexual images or messages via phone or computer, instructed anyone to contact police or not contact police, or reassigned suspected predators. We will keep you posted on this developing story. Here with an update on the Synod and more from Rome, I am joined by Editor-in-Chief of thecatholicthing.org, Robert Royal, and the Vatican correspondent for the National Catholic Register, Edward Pentin. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. Ed, I want to start with you. There seems to be a Babel-like quality coming from this Youth Synod. People are talking about migrants and women's rights and LGBT rights and environment and populism. These press briefings are a real grab bag. So my first question is, what is the real goal of this synod?
Well, this is the big question, Raymond. We don't know, and of course, what we see in these press conferences, perhaps sort of a bit of kite flying, seeing what they can possibly introduce in this synod. We do know, of course, what they're planning. The sort of the agenda, if you like, from the Instrumentum Laboris, the working document. But it's very sort of general. This synod. There's nothing really particularly specific, and people have said, there's not a lot of substance here. It's a lot of talk about listening to young people and key issues which keep coming up, like immigration and these kind of issues, and to try and help young people, obviously. Help them bring to the faith and live the faith, especially after, for example, confirmation. But there isn't really a great deal that's really, I think some people say, is really dealing with the real heart of the issues and the sufferings that young people face. And that people feel that hasn't really been tackled in any really extensive way. across the board in a sort of universal way for the universal church.
Yeah, well, look, as the father of some tweens and teens, I'm waiting to hear about Snapchat and, downloads. I haven't heard about that yet. Skateboard contests. Bishop Barron said all of these things are rigged, these synods, to an extent, or to some extent. But there is a desired end, and because of that, they have to be somewhat organized. Robert Royal, what is the desired end here as you see it?
Well, look, a lot of people were fearful that there was going to be an attempt to push LGBT and some of the other themes that we heard about in the earlier two synods on the family. I don't think that that is going to happen. From what we can tell, at least, and we have limited information, but I'll just give you one example. Today, the Archbishop of Bologna was asked by someone who belongs to a gay activist group. This Archbishop, by the way, wrote the foreword to the Italian translation of Father James Martin's book, Building a Bridge, so he's clearly sympathetic to that point of view. But he was asked, you talk about we shouldn't coldly apply the Church's moral teaching to people with same-sex attraction, and we should be welcoming and open. Have you seen that in the bishops? And he hemmed and hawed and could hardly get together a coherent sentence, and by the end all he could say was, well, it's a problem. So that fear, that ideological pressure, which I think was coming from the organizers of the synod more than from the young people, that doesn't seem to be going anywhere, and it looks indeed like some of the bishops have been emboldened by the support of the young people to be able to push back against that. So if you ask me what at this point the synod administration can hope for, I think that they've been emphasizing a lot that there's a very warm feeling of community, of creating friends with people who have not known each other in the past. And there's a kind of a generalized hope that this will spill over into new programs, new cooperation. But anything more substantive than that, unless we see some very bold move in the documents that are going to be drafted in the next week to 10 days, I don't think that we're going to see anything very, very powerful coming out of this synod.
Bob, there's a big difference here in that the final document, assuming it's accepted by the Pope, it will become part of the normal magisterium, part of church teaching. Now, previously, that was not the case. Quickly explain what that means.
Well, the normal magisterium of the church just means that it's sort of standard teaching, it's accepted teaching. The extraordinary magisterium is when the Pope declares in matters of faith and morals from the cathedra, from the seat of Peter, that something belongs to the deposit of faith. It's only happened twice, and they've both been Marian doctrines, as we well know. So this is kind of a way of saying almost that the synod, they've been resisting the idea that the synod is a parliament, but the synod has passed some laws or some ideas, and that the Pope has accepted them, and they are going to be operative somewhat in a way that maybe a lower-level papal statement is now authoritative inside the Church.
Ed, there are some new rules here. The final document is going to be voted on part by part instead of the entirety, and it'll require a two-thirds majority to pass each section. Some of the Synod Fathers have expressed concerns about this process. What are they saying?
Well, the concerns, Raymond, were earlier because we weren't sure at the beginning of the synod what precisely the voting procedures would be. And we only found out a couple of days ago exactly what they're going to be doing, which is basically what they did last time, which is a good thing because we'll get the voting on paragraph by paragraph of the final document, which will give us a good clue, a good idea of who's voting, or the numbers of who's voting for what. And those will have to get two-thirds majority for each paragraph to get through. So they've got to be acceptable really pretty much to everybody. And that is a good thing. But we're not really sure exactly the drafting of this document, how it's going to be done. We're not sure if some people think it's been written already, and they're just going to add a few things that the Synod Fathers want. But we're just going to have to see what the final document is. But at the moment, it seems as though they're taking input, they're listening to what the Synod Fathers are saying, and so we have every reason really to hope that it could be possibly a good document at the end of the day.
Ed, in the last synod, if I'm remembering correctly, in the 11th hour, there were insertions of passages and paragraphs that were rejected by the body of bishops, correct?
Yes, well, we had problems because, well, it was really the first synod, the first family synod. There were, I think, 3 paragraphs which didn't get a 2/3 majority, but the Pope insisted that those be carried over in any case into the next synod, which he's free to do, of course. But that was some concern, especially because now those 3 paragraphs, which are the controversial ones, people say, well, they got 2/3 majority by the synod bishops, but in fact they didn't, because the first synod they didn't get those 2/3 majority. So there was problems there, but I don't think we're going to see the same repeat of that, because this is just one synod. There can't be any paragraphs that are going to be taken over into a second one. So I don't think the Pope's going to do that, and I think we're going to get a very clear reading of who supports or the extent of support for each paragraph.
That's good news. During Monday's briefing, Robert Royal, Father Arturo Sosa, a Venezuelan Jesuit who the Pope named Superior General of the Jesuits about 2 years ago, he had this to say regarding the multicultural face of the Church. Listen.
The Church should show the multicultural face of the God who revealed himself in Nazareth and promote a universal citizenship that recognizes the richness that is brought by cultural diversity, and therefore build an intercultural world.
Robert, you were in the room when Sosa said that. You wrote about it. What do you think he meant there?
Well, I've been joking that this is sort of Teilhard de Chardin 2.0. Teilhard talked about how the age of nations had passed, and it was now necessary to build the world and build the entire universe toward the omega point of God. I have to say, I was in the room and I took notes on it. It was only until afterwards somebody pointed out to me how shocking that and incoherent that passage was, that it drew my attention to it. Because, for example, this universal citizenship, does it mean citizenship sort of in some sort of secular international body like the UN, or does it mean this universal belonging to the body of Christ, the Church that exists all over the world? It means so many things that in a way it means nothing. So it strikes you as that kind of thing, and the reason it went by me is it's the kind of language that people talk about that sounds very highfalutin, but in fact doesn't really attach very much to anything.
Well, I don't know what it has to do with the Youth Synod, but I'm digressing. A small group led by Honduran Cardinal Oscar Rodriguez Maradiaga was the only section to discuss homosexuals, surrogacy, and same-sex couples adoption. I want to play this for you, or I'll put this on the screen rather. It's a statement from that group. They said, there is the issue of what to do and how to act with homosexuals, which cannot remain outside of our pastoral activity and other realities, such as marriage between homosexuals, wombs for rent, adoption on the part of couples of the same sex, all of which are current issues and favored and sponsored by international government institutions. Ed Pentin, this seems to be a reoccurring theme at this synod in dribs and drabs. What are gay activists seeking here, and what's been the reaction of the bishops in the synod hall?
Well, I mean, I think the goal is quite clear, that they want to normalize homosexual activity within the Church. I think that's quite clear, and you're seeing that even in the press conferences. We have representatives from homosexual groups who are trying to do this, trying to make homosexuality acceptable in the Church. But I think we're not seeing a great deal of, as Robert said, we're not seeing a great deal of support for this, I think, at least in the Synod Hall. Whether that's the case with the Synod managers, those running it, we can't say yet. But there is this push, and I think this has been going on for some time. There's been a lobby which since 2014 has been pushing this, and I think we're just seeing the fruits of that in this Synod, and I think that they feel that they have a good chance of succeeding, and that's why they're pushing this. But the interesting thing about that paragraph is that it wasn't homosexuality isn't mentioned in the first and third part it's only mentioned rather in the first and third part of the working document, not in the second part. And that was the part that was discussed this week or last week, and yet it still found its way into the small working groups and into the discussions there. So there is definitely a push to get this in. And there was a Chilean youth auditor who also brought it up and said we have to.
Yeah, so hold on, I'm going to go to that.
Very,
yeah, I want to get to that now, Ed. A Chilean youth invited to take part in the synod had this to say about what she was hearing from non-Catholics. Watch.
The answer I received from these non-Christian youths was even more powerful than the answer I received from Christian youths. They talk about a multicultural church that's open to all, that should not be judgmental, a community that makes everybody feel at home, reflecting the message of Jesus Christ. The church should not discriminate against minorities or people with different sexual orientations or who are poorer.
What do you make of that?
Well, again, I mean, it's another attempt to really introduce this into the debate, but it's but as I say, I don't think it's getting much traction. I think there is problems with this, and I think it's not being really accepted. But it is a problem, and it's something which it's also revealing, really, because I think a lot of the youth auditors, although they're all very good, I'm sure, and they're saying good things, but they're of a certain type as well, and I think they've made sure that there are youth auditors like this Chilean woman who want to push this kind of thing. You're not hearing much of those saying, you know, we want to uphold the Church's teaching. Well, there's not much reassertion of what the Church teaches, especially on this issue.
Bob, what did you think of this? I mean, I found it odd that you had one of these auditors, youth auditor, who gets up and says, look, I've been talking to all these non-Catholic people, and they have a lot to say. I mean, what other community, what other communion would bring in people who disagree with it or have no connection to it so they can help adapt the teaching of the Church? I mean, when did this become the synod on those who reject Church teaching? Robert Royal.
Well, there's been a very clever propaganda campaign that pro-gay groups have been carrying out. And you see it in that remark by that young woman, that when you say the Church shouldn't discriminate, well, of course it shouldn't discriminate. It shouldn't discriminate against anyone. It should treat people with dignity and with human respect. They're made in the image and likeness of God. But there's a difference between saying that even somebody shouldn't have, there shouldn't be even civil discrimination against somebody, and saying that the Church cannot make a firm statement of moral teaching, and that not only, I mean, see, what I think happens here is an elision between this desire for non-discrimination and acceptance of the actual practice. Now, that's something entirely different, and we need some adults in the room, and there have been a few, to stand up and say, look, there's a difference here. Yes, no one wants to discriminate in some sense of the word, discriminate against people, but the Catholic Church teaches something different, and in fact, it teaches something that is helpful to people who find themselves with same-sex attraction. That distinction is not generally made by young people. This is why we need authoritative sources in the Church to make clear what we've known since the first pages of Genesis. Male and female, He created them. That is the basis on which the Christian faith and even the Jewish faith rests.
Ed, what is the real role of these 36 young people in attendance? Look, I've met some of these people. They are doing, you know, in individual cases, some incredible work with youth ministry and reaching out. And so they get swept into this, and they're very offended when you say, well, this youth synod is kind of, what is it? It seems off the rails. But here's my real question. I think the audience wants to know this too. They can't vote. So what is their role here, other than kind of nice backdrop? Do they each get a little feverino during the synod where they can speak their piece for an allotted time?
Yes, I mean, they do get quite a bit of input. I mean, they're allowed to contribute to the discussions and give their own interventions as well, certainly in the small groups, but I think in the general congregations too. So they are given a certain amount of exposure, and I think and they're obviously grateful for that. And I think that is. I think people think that's a good thing because it is getting input from young people. But as I say, I think the question mark is how have they been chosen, and have they been chosen because they support a certain agenda, or do they support? Do they really fully support the Church's teaching? It's hard to say. But I think on the whole, though, I think the interventions have been good, and I think people have been happy with those, and they have been. I think the Synod Fathers say they're very grateful for their contributions.
In response to some of the voices at the Synod, Cardinal Robert Sarah, the prefect of the Congregation for Divine Worship and Sacraments, had this to say regarding church teaching on sexuality. He said the Church and its pastors should courageously propose the Christian ideal corresponding to Catholic moral doctrine and not water it down, hiding the truth to attract young people to the bosom of the Church. The Church's teaching may not be shared by everyone, but no one can say that it is not clear. However, there may be a lack of clarity on the part of some pastors in explaining the doctrine, and that requires a profound examination of conscience. How do you think this was accepted, Robert, and received?
Well, we hear that this got a very enthusiastic response. One of the stories that comes out, we're not inside the room, inside the actual hall of the Synod, but it's been reported that the young people tend to whoop, the way young people do when they hear something that they like. And at first there was a certain uneasiness about this in a formal setting like a Synod of Bishops, which is what we're at here. But that the Holy Father himself went up there and said to them, keep it up. He liked the idea that there was this kind of energy that they were bringing to the discussion. But as far as Sarah is concerned, it seems like there was a very strong wave of support behind him. I don't know if it was the young people, but that's at least the reports that I've heard coming out of the room. And I'm not surprised, because that seems to be you have to kind of judge the overall spirit that begins to take hold in an event like this. And it seems like an affirmation that's a warm affirmation, it's welcoming, but still a firm affirmation of what the Church teaches is central to this Synod.
Robert, you write that the future has been a hot topic at the Synod, and that despite the numbers of young people who've turned away, that there's hope. However, you point out that there's been only one passing mention of the need for stable marriages and an openness to life at this Synod, no mention of Humanae Vitae, which is the landmark encyclical, it has its 50th anniversary this year. Are you surprised by that?
Well, absolutely. What I said in that article the other day was that you can see that the focus of the Church is on holding these young people, primarily from about the age of 16 to 29, maybe as high as 30-something. That's the group that they know is in jeopardy, they know is leaving the Church, that they hope they can find some way to call back. But there's one of the things that struck me enormously is there's no mention of these people having children. One of the ways, as we know, that people in their adult lives tend to come back to the faith if they've left, is that they have children, they realize that responsibility is a part of being an adult, and one of those responsibilities is connecting with something divine, connecting with something larger than the human. So there are a number of gaps here. Humanae Vitae, of course, isn't necessarily the best foot to step forward with this particular cohort of people, but it's going to have to be talked about sooner or later, and one would have hoped, and maybe we'll see this in the final document, that there will at least be some affirmation of be fruitful and multiply and have dominion over the earth. I think that would be a very powerful message to young people.
I've got to move on to this. Ed, the Jesuit paper Civiltà Cattolica published a transcript of a dialogue between Pope Francis and Jesuits from some Baltic countries during a recent visit. He said, quote, "I believe that the Lord is asking for a change in the Church. I've said many times that a perversion of the Church today is clericalism. But 50 years ago, the Second Vatican Council clearly said it, the Church is the people of God. I feel the Lord wants the Council to make its way into the Church." What changes do you think he's talking about there? Hasn't the Council already made its way into the Church over 50 years?
Well, this is a good question, Raymond, and I think we're seeing what the Pope's planning here with the synods, because I think he sees the synods in the same way that Cardinal Carlo Maria Martini saw them, and he wanted the synods to become like a sort of a permanent, or sort of revolutionary synods that make have more influence really on the church, like the council did. Obviously not exactly like the council, but have a sort of a reflection of it. That was also Paul VI's view, of course. But I think Francis wants to make the synods, as Cardinal Martini did, very much a sort of, as you say, a theology of the people, of the people of God, having the say in the church, and really having a sort of bottom-up, grassroots governance of the church. And this is one way he wants to do it. Yeah. And I think this is what you're seeing with these synods. It's very much a reflection of the Pope's vision for the church, which is very much more of a horizontal church.
Bob, during a presser on Monday, Superior General to the Jesuits, Father Sosa, who we played earlier, had this to say regarding the reality of Vatican II in the church. Listen.
Personally, I believe that Vatican II introduced an ecclesiological model that is not real yet. For 50 years, this has not happened yet. We make steps forward, we made progress at times, and at other times we took a step back. But that model of church that was proposed by Vatican II, with the people of God at the center, because the church is God's people, I believe that this model has not really come to life completely.
Now, Bob, the Pope seems to be in agreement with this. Are we beginning to see the first in a series of what are essentially mini Vatican IIIs, little synods, piece by piece remaking individual pieces of church teaching?
Well, insofar as there's anything that we can concretely identify in what Father Sosa said there, it's clear that there's a thrust almost toward a democratization of the church. Now, it's true that there probably needs to be a little bit more bottom-up communication, I think is the way to put it. And that's often been talked about in this synod as well. The bishops need to hear more from their people, and I think that that part is to the good. But the church is not a democracy. This has been said over and over again, and it's been said over and over again since Vatican II, that because it receives an authoritative teaching from God himself, and that it's been charged by Jesus to teach the people of all nations, that it brings a truth of revelation to the people of all nations, it simply cannot be the case that the church becomes a debating society like some sort of democratic parliament. It's often denied that that's what the church is trying to do right now, but I think that there's a general direction like that, that if pursued radically the way I think Father Sosa would like it to do, to me, would probably spell the end of the church as we know it.
The head of the press office had this to say on Thursday. He said, and I'll roll this for you.
A proposal was made to establish a pontifical council, speaking of the young, a pontifical council of the young. And its president should be considered on the same footing as other dicasteries, and it could be a woman.
Now, Bob, I don't know why a woman was important to it, or it couldn't be led by a man, or a man and a woman, but he particularly mentioned it could be led by a woman. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think these are the kinds of things, they're almost shibboleths, that you have to keep mentioning women, and there's going to be a number of women playing important roles in the church in the future. We already know this. There are places, of course, where that makes sense. But the fact that he said this, I think, is kind of condescending to women, that somehow, we're going to set up something that you guys can have your little power over. I think that this sort of talk in front of young people in particular is something that they detect to be not entirely sincere. That you pick the best person for the job. You don't pick a man or a woman because of their gender. You have a job that you want to have done. I'm not so sure it's a good idea, by the way, to start a new office of some kind on youth. But if there is one, let's pick the person who's the best person to do that, given what the goals are that office is going to be set up to achieve. I think that this sort of affirmative action in advance is it's noxious in civil society, and I think it would be a bad idea in the church.
Yeah, well, I also think something is being lost in the middle of this conversation, in that Jesus said, "Go and tend to my sheep, feed my sheep." He didn't tell the sheep to feed the shepherd. And I think sometimes this is getting inverted, and I do worry that not all sheep are equal, in the sense that they aren't formed, they don't fully understand the history, the current doctrine of the church. And if you can't articulate that and don't have a firm understanding of that, I don't know how then you can share or shape or seek to adjust the current teaching before us. And I do see that. Now, the Pope might take a very different view. In Tuesday's homily, he warned against the rigidity of Christians. He said this: be careful around those who are rigid. Be careful around Christians, be they laity, priests, bishops, who present themselves as so perfect, rigid. Be careful. There's no Spirit of God there. They lack the spirit of liberty. How do you think that's being read in Rome? I'll ask both of you that question. Ed Pentin, I'll start with you.
Well, like all his other comments, Raymond, about like this, where he talks about rigidity and doctors of the law, and I think people are concerned about this who are trying to uphold the Church's teaching, and they feel that they're being attacked by the Pope just because they're trying to be rigid, as it were, in trying to uphold the commandments of the Church. Now, I did talk to Cardinal Schönborn about this, and he said, well, he's not really saying that. He's just trying to appeal to, or trying to really convict anyone in their heart who might have this kind of attitude. It's not necessarily directed at any particular group. But I did say that, well, if that's the case, why doesn't he say it? And he couldn't really answer that. And I think it is upsetting for people who do feel attacked by this just because they're really trying to uphold the Church's teaching.
Yeah. Well, I know it's been applied to certain cardinals who've raised their voices in recent days, and Archbishop Vigano and others. Tell me about this Australian letter, Ed. You reported on this. There are a group of laity as well as clergy who are writing, and I'll read this: when the Church eschews the truth for policy speak, young people are left with only superficial banalities to express their beliefs. Deliberately unclear words are ironically relied on and repeated with rigidity. The Church should not discourage young people following its rules in love, nor its priests from teaching them. How is that idea being represented, and is it being represented in the Synod, and why is it necessary to write what is essentially a petition of this sort?
Well, I think there is a concern that these kind of views aren't being fully represented in the Synod. There has been talk about, Cardinal Sandri talked about those in the East, young people in the East who want to have clear teaching, and they want this kind of clarity of teaching and radical witness, as he put it. But you're not really hearing that much in the Synod, I think. And what I think these young people in Australia were very... I think was very interesting what they said about, as you said earlier, that the Church, they can't be expected to shape the Church and to help shape the Church if they're not being formed themselves in the truth of Christ, if they're not being educated in the faith and giving clear guidance. They say they don't want any more unambiguous. They don't want unambiguous truth. They want they want truth. They don't want any ambiguity. So I think that what they really want is all that clarity. And clarity of teaching, and they just don't feel they're getting it. And I think what we're seeing in this Synod is just more ambiguity, or at least that seems to be the case from the press briefings today.
Robert Royal, final question for you. Two institutes that oversee the large swaths of religious around the world, both men and female religious, they are urging the Pope to allow women a vote in the Synod. What is your take on this? Is this just kind of more activist sideshow, or is this being taken seriously?
Well, I think it's part of this sort of generalized democratizing talk that you want to include women. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that the mistake that was made in the organizing of this Synod is to allow the leaders of a number of religious orders to be voting members. This is a synod of bishops. I mean, that's been said actually a couple of times during briefings, that this is a synod of bishops. The young people don't have votes. If you're going to allow the heads of men's religious orders to vote, then it does look like
Right.
It's just fair to allow the heads of women's religious groups to vote.
Yeah.
But I think that the right thing to have done here was to have made this simply a synod of bishops, and anything else that needs to be done to allow input for men or women of whatever backgrounds, that could have been done in a different way.
No, interesting point and great perspectives. Thank you both for being here, and get some rest. Robert Royal's Synod reports and commentary can be found at thecatholicthing.org, and you can follow Edward Pentin's fine reporting at ncregister.com. Thank you both.